So we're recording now.
Awesome. Cool.
So this is the Creativity Talks, and today it's just me hosting. Rene is out with her family, and we're here with Fabeku Fatunmise. Did I say your name correctly?
Fatunmise, close enough.
Okay, Fatunmise. Fabeku is an artist, a writer, an author, a spiritual practitioner, a community builder, and a business consultant with a focus on building businesses that work and feel like home. And I'm sure many more things. So that's just the kind of drive-by intro, and then we'll dive into all the depth behind that. So I wanted to start off by asking you, because you put in your notes that you have this fascination with coherence in
Yes.
self, community, work, and life.
Yeah.
And I wanted to jump into asking you what that means to you.
Yeah. So coherence. When I talk about it, kind of the short definition I give is the whole of who you are pointed in the same direction at the same time, right? Because
Mhm.
I think that, so one of the examples I use a lot when I'm doing business consulting is, somebody makes a thing, they've got a new thing they want to put out in the world. So it's done. They go on social media to the newsletter list, whatever it is, and they say, hey, I've got a thing, give me money, it's awesome. And on one hand, they feel that. And on another hand, there's the part that thinks, well, what if nobody likes it? What if they hate it? What if this fails? What if I don't make any money? What if I've screwed this up? What if people see me? What if it works, right? All of this weird stuff. And so there's one part of them that's sort of forward moving in terms of, hey, I've got a new thing and I'd like you to see it. And then there's the other part of them that's kind of moving in reverse. That's like, oh no, what if people see it? Or what if people don't see it? And so even in that, there's this kind of very simple tug of war that happens, right? And I think it happens inside of us. I think it happens around us. I think it happens in terms of sort of the frequency behind what we do. And I think it happens all the time, right? People are like, I want more clients, but can I handle more clients? I want to make more money, but what is that going to mean? And, all of this stuff. And so I think coherence is uncommon because we're complex. And so at the end of the day, to me, it's about how do we get all of who we are moving in the same way at the same time, with the understanding that it's not a destination, right? It's a process. We don't just land and say, ta-da, I'm coherent. It's like, well, I'm coherent right now, and I might not be in 10 minutes or in 10 weeks or in 10 years or, whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's just all of us moving in the same way at the same time.
Yeah, I love that, because I've heard similar concepts, like sovereignty is a big one, or self-possession,
Mm-hmm.
or even self-actualization a little bit. But I love coherence because, one, it sort of implies a frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of imagine like a grid, like a sonar grid, and
Yeah.
you know, you can have like all these different little plots on the grid, right? And it doesn't really amount to a pattern or to something meaningful. But when you're coherent, it's like that laser of the energy going to a one pointed kind of, let's say, goal or expression, maybe is a better way to put it.
Well, no, because I mean, that's exactly it. That's a great way to talk about it, because what happens with coherence, so when we work on getting somebody coherent in their business or life or relationship or self or whatever, all of a sudden there's a level of momentum that they haven't had before, right? Because it's kind of like, to use another metaphor, if you get in the car and you press the gas and then the brake and the gas and then the brake, and sometimes you're pressing both, like, where are you going? Like, you're going nowhere is where you're going. And so when we become coherent, another way of talking about it is there's an absence of resistance. And when we can sustain that, there's not only the presence of momentum, but at some point, when you have that coherence, the momentum, and the absence of resistance, there's almost this kind of superconductive quality that happens. And
Yeah.
so suddenly people are like, wait a minute, way more stuff is happening way more easily and way better and more effective, and I'm getting better responses and I feel better. And it's like, right, because you're not moving in 100 different directions, and all of a sudden the stuff that didn't seem doable is super doable and way more effective.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of my teachers kind of talked about the same thing, and he would say you can either dig one really deep well, or you can dig a lot of really shallow wells if you hit water, right? So what to you does coherence have to do with creativity? Is there a direct relationship between the two?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, so I'll just speak for myself as an example. So, I've made art since I was a little kid, and I spent the majority of my adult life feeling very incoherent around the art that I made. There was a whole lot of, I wish it was more of this and less of that. I wish I could do this and not this. I wish it looked more like this person's art or that person's art or whatever it was. And I was fighting that. So there was this deep movement to art, to make art, sort of running simultaneous with this thing of like, yeah, but I wish my art was different, or I wish I was a different artist, or whatever it was. And so it was always this really super conflicted thing. And then now finally at this point in my life, I really genuinely love the art that I'm making. Like I really, really dig what I'm doing. And so what that means is I'm doing more of it. I'm making more art than ever. I'm making the best art of my life. I'm selling almost 100% of the art that I make. And mostly I love it. Like I make, and it, not from some weird inflated ego way, but I make a painting and I just stand there and look at it. I'm like, how did I do this? Like that's
Yeah.
kind of amazing. And I mean, I'll be 48 in January. This is my first time in my life I've had this experience, and it's very recent, like within the last couple of years. Until then, it has been a whole lot of push and pull and this and that and more of this and less of that. And it, to me, it's made all the difference. Like it now, to me, art feels like a purely generative thing instead of this like additive subtractive kind of a nonsense thing that it's been for 40 whatever years.
Sure. So when you were talking about when you're younger, and you had kind of this, almost like this feeling of you wanted to create something and you weren't able to, or you weren't creating what exactly you wanted to create, was that like once you had already decided, okay, I want to be an artist, or was that like prior to the artistic identity taking place?
I think it's been the entire time, right? So I would create something, and so for a while it was, well, I wish I could paint more photorealistic stuff, but really I didn't, because I didn't have any desire to learn that. Like I had a great respect for it, but it's like, well, that's easy. That's a skill thing. If you want to do that, you learn that. But I didn't, because I didn't actually want to learn that. But then there was the push pull of like, but I should, but I don't want to. But I should, but I don't want to. Right. So then there was that. And then, it was even just simple stuff like, I wish my lines looked different. I don't even know what that means, right? But it's like somehow I would look at the line that somebody else would make, and that line seemed better than mine, right? I mean, some of it I think was just that weird, comparison stuff that people do.
Yeah.
But I think at the core of it, there was a thing of like just not being at home with the art that I make, right? Not being at home with the art that this body produces, that this lineage has produced. And now I'm on the other side of it. It's like, no, the lines are what they are because it comes from this body and this lineage and this decades of experience. And so now it's not only that I just accept it, but I really love what it is. But that
Right.
just has not always been the thing. It was always more color or less color or different lines or better shapes or more realistic or less real, all of it. It was wild. It's been wild.
Yeah. And it's almost like the cart has become the horse in a sense, like that you love it for the expression rather than you're expressing for some kind of product, right? Like you're
Yeah,
trying to create some kind of product.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah. And
absolutely.
what do you think shifted that for you?
I think at some point it really did come down to just being at peace with the lineage of what I do, like looking at all the shaping influences behind it, right? Realizing that, when I was a kid, street art, graffiti was a big thing for me. Understanding why Jean-Michel Basquiat has always made more sense to me than any other artist that I've seen for the most part, right? So it's like, right, this is the stuff that is the these are the frequencies that make sense to who I am. These are the sort of home base frequencies. So given that, of course, this is what my art looks like and feels like and comes from. So why am I trying to, so for example, like another artist that I always loved is Dali, right? But I don't paint like him. That's not, and I think that's where a lot of the like, oh, you should be able to paint more realistic stuff because then I could paint giant spindly legged elephants on fire and they would, which is cool, but that's not my lineage, right?
Uh-huh.
And so at some point it's like, right, you grew up with spray paint and punk rock and Basquiat and so this is the art you make. And so I think it just became a thing of like, oh, not only do I appreciate the art, but I appreciate why the art is what it is. And so now I can just inhabit that instead of fighting to make it something that it was never designed to be in the first place. Ever.
Right. Yeah, and just let it move through you rather
Yeah,
than trying to make it into something.
yeah, for sure.
So when you say lineage, what is your artistic lineage?
Yeah, so from me, the way I talk about lineage is it's basically any shaping influence, right? So it can certainly be people, but it's ideas, it's places, it's music, it's movies, it's books, right? So for me, punk rock was a massive thing. You know, the Ramones, the Clash, Sex Pistols, all of that stuff. Again, Basquiat was a huge and still is a huge part. Dali was a part of that. Um, you know, there was a part of Cincinnati. I grew up in Cincinnati, and there's an area called Short Vine that back when I was a kid was this very rough kind of punk rock area with record shops and a Perkins, and it was just a wild kind of a place. But it was a formative place to me because everybody there was artists. Like everybody there was engaged in some kind of or many kinds of art. You know, there's that. There's you know, to me, a big part of my personal practice has to do with a particular spiritual practice from West Africa, right? So that space, that ecology, that worldview, the visuals, that's all a part of it. You know, it's been a part of my life for I don't know 25 years or whatever it's been. So all of that stuff gets woven into it. Even and that's been a large shaping influence for me in terms of even what art is for me and why I do art, right? Looking at art as a sort of talisman, as a transmission, right? So that in and of itself has shaped it. So yeah, it's been this kind of wild, I don't know, kind of collage of stuff that's come together, and it's like, well, right, this is why you make the art you make, of course, you
Or
know, yeah.
and how about your ancestral lineage? Does that come into it as well?
Um, a little bit, you know, I think for me, I think where it really comes in. So, my dad wanted to be an artist, right? And so he kind of ran into the usual stuff of when he was a kid. He told his parents, "Hey, I want to be an artist." And they're like, "Nope, you're out of your mind. Terrible idea. You can't do that. Go get an actual job." So, you know, he grew up to do this kind of very weird high level corporate job thing. And he was miserable and he hated it and he was miserable to be around. And, you know, he died when I was 18, kind of very suddenly. And for me, beyond just the grief of like, wait, my dad's dead, almost immediately following that was like, oh my God, he never got to be an artist. Like he died and never got to do the thing and was miserable on so many different levels. And I think that was like my dad should have been an artist. He was wired to be an artist. He didn't have the personality to be sitting in some glass office somewhere with a briefcase and nonsense like that. That wasn't his thing. But that's what he did. And I think he got really sideways with himself and with everybody else around him because of that. And for me, there's not a moment that I don't pick up a paintbrush that I don't think about that.
Mhm.
Every single time I think about it. Every time I walk into the studio to paint, I think about my dad never got to do this, you
Yeah.
know? So yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah.
So that's especially interesting to me because you are an artist and you also are very involved in business,
Yeah.
which may just be kind of how it has to be these days as an artist. It's almost like imperative to be involved in business. But how do you see those two kind of crisscrossing and complementing one another?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, and I think what you said is right. So I think if people want to make art to make art, awesome. Then you can ignore all of the business stuff and just make all the art you want to, and that's an amazing thing. And I think that's fantastic. I don't think there's ever any push or pressure to, hey, turn this into a business. But
Right.
if you want to, then you just have to figure out the business thing, right? Like the number of artists that I work with who show up and they're like, "Yeah, I just want to paint." Okay, cool, then paint, but then you don't want to have an art business, right?
Right.
Like because you can't, that's not how it works, right? And
Yeah.
so, you know, I think there is, and I think for me it shaped the way I do business, right? The kind of the worldview behind it, and kind of looking, you know, because to me I look at art as a sort of invitation into whatever the art is and whatever it means and whatever it's doing. And to me, that's what marketing is. Like it doesn't have to be some gross, pushy, twisty, manipulative, nonsensy kind of thing. It's like, hey, here's an invitation to a thing. And if you like it and it makes sense, then cool, right? Whether that's, hey, buy this piece of art, or, you know, take this course, whatever, it doesn't matter, whatever it is. But to me, I think there's a way to do that. And yeah, I don't know. I think there's a weird, listen, I mean, every artist gets and has struggled with the whole starving artist archetype thing.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I would love to just see that fall completely away, right? Again, you don't have to make money from your art, but if you want to, I want you to really understand how to do that so you can make as much money from your art as you want to make, whether that's $50,000 a year or $500,000 a year. I don't care.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, you have to understand some basics about business, which at the end of the day, to me, is just about the basics of relationship. Like that's it. That's all business is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So does your consulting focus mainly on artists?
I focus mostly on creative people, including lots of artists. So visual artists, writers, performers, literal rock stars, but also people that are teaching or coaching or but people that are doing things in a way that's not the usual way, right? And that usually feel like, yeah, my thing doesn't really fit into the usual models that I see. So now I don't really know what to do.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how do you find that relationship supports that or informs that?
I don't know how anybody has a business without relationships, honestly.
Sure.
Like, so one of the things that I've said, the best thing I've ever done for my business was a thing that wasn't for my business at all. It was literally just building relationships with people, not so that you would give me money, but just so we had a relationship. And the fact that we had a relationship then, so as an example, like I was on Twitter a million years ago before Twitter was a disaster. And I had no idea how to market anything. So I just got on Twitter and talked about like, hey, I'm listening to this music, or like these are the shoes that I'm wearing, and just completely inane stuff. But I built relationships, and then people were like, oh, hey, what do you do? And I told them, and they're like, awesome, I'd like to give you money for that. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And then I just realized, well, right, this is how it always happens. You have to build genuine relationships with people, and then business happens because of that. But I think there's a weird, I think one of the sideways things with a lot of the marketing stuff is like they treat relationships as a tactic. And it's like that's not what they are. So that doesn't work. I mean, you can pull that off in the short term, but then everybody realizes, oh, you're just building a relationship with me as a tactic. So then we don't actually have a relationship, right? Like
Right.
there's people that have been a part of my work world for 20 years. Like I've seen their kids be born and grow up and graduate high school.
Yeah.
And those are real relationships. And that's why my business in part has sustained itself for as long as it has. So to me, I don't know how anybody builds or sustains a business without having actual relationships that aren't just about, hey, give me money.
Yeah. And so
So
in that sense, do you see business as community building? Do you see them as one and the same?
absolutely. I mean, there's always been community around what I do because I don't know. I think it's a weird idea that we can somehow just exist in these little like DIY bubbles,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
And so I don't know how that happens. And I also think, and I feel it more now than ever, particularly just because of the pandemic stuff over the last few years. I don't know how people exist without communities,
mhm.
of some kind. And so, yeah, for me, it's always been about, I think the business has been kind of a side effect of the community and not the other way around for me.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and arguably, on the one hand, business wouldn't exist without the community existing first, because ultimately, if we have a business, we're meeting the needs of the community,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Unless it's like a completely manufactured need,
Right.
which
Right.
more and more we have that on a large scale, but it doesn't seem like an easy thing for an individual to do,
Yeah.
nor a soul nourishing thing for an individual.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in a sense, a business, from the standpoint of community, a business is just an extension of our offering to the community, right?
Yeah, to me, it's the goodness that we bring to community,
Yeah,
and the fact that I get to make a living doing it, and your life gets better when I do it, and our relationship deepens as we do it together. That's awesome. That's an
totally
awesome thing. Yeah,
right. So I also noticed that you wrote about creativity as a profound oracle and practical medicine.
yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I feel like so many of the big questions in my life have been answered by making art, right?
Yeah,
Like in the moments when I have no idea who I am and what's happening and where I'm going and why I'm going or how any of it, I just paint. And then I start to realize, oh right, why am I constantly using pink in the paintings? What is that? So it's almost in some ways not exactly the same, but almost like when people divine with tarot cards, right? What does that mean? Why are there small houses in all the paintings that I just made? Why is there pink? Why am I suddenly fascinated by round canvas? Why whatever it is. And sometimes I'll paint with that question in mind, and sometimes I don't. But then I look and I'm like, oh, that's just answered the question that I have. Or if nothing else, it's given me clues to follow. It's like, again, what does that mean? And so if this thing is showing up, if I sit with this and hang out with this, what does it tell me? What are the questions that it asks? What are the questions that it answers? What does it point me to? What does it tell me about what I'm wondering about, or who I am, or all of those things? And I think at an even deeper level, so I think a big part of the work that I do with people is kind of understanding the medicine behind the work that you do, right? Why do you do what you do? Why do you do it in the way you do it? What's the medicine behind it, and why is that medicine there, and how do you carry it, and what does that mean for who you are as a human being in the world and in your relationships, and with whatever is yours to do in life? And I think every bit of that can be found in our creativity, whether that's creativity through making paintings or raising kids or loving people or making food or whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's the same. It's all the same thing. And so to me, there's a really deep oracular component to that. And I don't know that with some time and with some curiosity that there's not any question that we can't answer when we engage with that in that way.
Sure. Yeah, I've had similar experiences with painting where I feel like it slips under the conscious mind, right? So we are
Absolutely.
able to, the conscious mind's doing its making its grocery lists, doing whatever, thinking about the show you watched or what you're doing tomorrow or whatever. But the painting is happening independently of that, or in spite of that, let's say.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, there's impulses that arise that are beyond the conscious mind that maybe create little houses or use the color pink or whatever. And so in that way, it's sort of communing directly with the subconscious in a material way, which is kind of rare. Like there's not a lot of medium we can operate in where I feel like we're directly interacting in such a tactile way
Yeah.
with the subconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's for me, because a lot of the art that I do has just kind of layer after layer after layer, like 50 or 60 layers sometimes of things.
Mhm.
And then when I'm done, I look back and I'm like, oh wait, like that word that I scribbled is still visible. Why is that one word of the 200 words that I put on that canvas? Why is that the word that's visible? And
Mhm.
why is that in relationship to the eye and the face and the flower that's next to it? And what does it mean? Like, what's the story of that? Again, if I treat that as a tarot card, what is that? What's the message behind that?
Yeah. And
You know, and it's and it's and the thing is, it's not stuff that it's not when I'm doing it, like I'm going to leave this word visible. I mean,
right.
sometimes, but it's like when I'm done, I look and I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that. So why? Why is that the thing that's there?
Yeah. And does your art surprise you often in that sense?
Every single time.
Every time.
Because for me, there's a lot of times where, I mean, I don't ever really sit down at this point and like, oh, I'm going to paint a house. It's like, I'm going to put a color here. And then I'm going to figure out what color wants to go next to it and what shape wants to go
Yeah.
next to that. Oh, and then it turns into a house, right? But there's a whole lot where I can be pretty far into a painting and have no idea what it is and not even sure whether I like it or not. But
Mhm.
then I add one color and it's like, oh my God, it's beautiful. And now I know what this thing is. But literally until that yellow got next to that pink, I didn't know what was going on, you know? And so, yeah, it feels there's a weird kind of call and response
Mhm.
for me. And then at some point I get like, oh, cool, this is the song we're singing. Awesome. Cool. Let's do that. So,
Yeah. And when you say we, what do you suppose that other force is, beyond the self, beyond the me?
yeah. So for me, I always talk about the paintings that I do as talismanic. And I mean that in a very literal sense, right? Like there's a medicine to the piece, which means then there's a spirit behind the piece. There's a soul in the piece. And so we're just in conversation. And so to me, it's kind of like you and I are having a conversation. Like, I don't know what we're going to talk about in 2 minutes, but we'll figure it out and it'll be cool. Right. And sometimes for me, the conversation is easy from the beginning and sometimes it's not. Like in this last series of paintings I did, there was this really beautiful pink that I was building, but I didn't know what it was. And it felt almost like being on one of those weird, awkward first dates where you're like, I don't know why I'm here. And I feel like maybe I should just go home. And then suddenly they ask you a question and it's like, oh my God, you're fascinating. Tell me everything about you. I mean, that's how it was. I spent weeks with this pink, like, yeah, this is really pretty and kind of cool, but I don't know about this thing. And then there was just this very specific shade of yellow that I mixed up, and the whole thing just opened up. And then it felt like we just talked our heads off the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Right. But that whole initial phase was just a very weird kind of like, so how do you like the weather kind of conversation for a while. It was just, it was weird and kind of awkward. And then suddenly it was just, it was different. So
Yeah, that, in the last podcast that we did, we talked about a courtship happening, and that really reminds me of it. Whatever this, whether it's a color or an experience or a canvas type or whatever. In the other podcast, we were talking about the composer of the music that the artist was working with. There's like a courtship happening where it's really not about the artist themselves, the person expressing or the person doing that, it's about this relationship with some other energy or entity or even consciousness, you might say. What do you think that is? Like, what do you think is the purpose behind that?
I think for me, a lot of it has to do with having an active dialogue with, I mean, whatever we call it, right? The unseen, the spiritual world, the supernatural, the ancestors, all of it. It feels like that's just a very concrete way for me to interface with that and to have a dialogue with it, and then to kind of concretize it in some form that you can hang on your wall when you're done, But it feels like making this kind of intangible stuff tangible, and being able to then just have a really active dialogue with it in the process of doing that.
Sure, like taking like something like the color yellow that's so intangible, something conceptual like that, and then really having a relationship and building intimacy with it. And of course doing so in a way that's you might say is subjective, like maybe that's not going to be the way that the color yellow is experienced by another person, but you're having some kind of intimacy with it where you're having such a personalized experience and going into it.
And for sure. And I think that I may not experience that color yellow the same way again, right? So there's something about on that canvas next to that pink, next to that shape, it opened everything up. Now, if I go mix up that color yellow again, maybe it does something totally different. Right. Which is kind of cool.
And so, that speaks to kind of how art brings you, I perceive art as bringing you into the present and into a moment that will never happen again. And obviously we're always in a moment that will never happen again, but the difference is the conscious relationship with it, where we can be so intimate in a moment. And I mean, literally we're making love with it because we're that intimate to it,
Well, and I think that's it. Like you're right. Every moment will never happen again. But I think when you're that active in creating it, I think intimacy is a perfect way of talking about it, because it's not just like sitting and casually like, yeah, no, this moment will never happen. It's like, wait, this thing that I just did in relationship with this other thing has made a thing that's extraordinary. And this is it. Like right here, right now, this is the thing. To me, that feels miraculous that we're able to even do that.
Sure. It's like alchemy or something.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk a little more about cohering and your upcoming program and what was the inspiration behind that and the details as well.
Yeah. So in the particular spirituality that I practice that comes from the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria and the kind of surrounding areas, there's this concept called Ori, right? Ori is the way it's spelled. And it's a Yoruba word that means head, but it doesn't just mean our physical head, right? So Ori is this facet of who we are that it's sort of like the soul, but kind of not, right? So it's here and it's in the invisible spaces. It has a lot to do with destiny, which is not the same as like fate or predestination or any of that stuff. Basically, just our way through the world. And at the end of the day, there's this very simple understanding that all of the stuff that's ours to do happens more easily when we're coherent with our Ori, right? In other words, when we're coherent with these deeper parts of ourself that are related to our destiny, then we're able to kind of move through the world in the way that we could and would love to move through the world, right?
Mhm.
So kind of fundamentally, everything that I know about coherence kind of comes back to this. And because of sort of who Ori is and what Ori does, there's not really anything in our life that it's not connected to. So it matters for business and relationships and money and health and dream, everything, right? And so, what I realize, for those of us that have not grown up in Yoruba culture, we don't know about Ori. Like, we don't know there's this thing that is this biggest, deepest part of us that's our way through the world, much less that we can be kind of in active relationship with it and that we can either be coherent with it or not. So
Yeah.
for me, that feels like a really important thing to talk about.
Mhm.
You know? And that comes from my original elder in the tradition who passed a few years ago. One of the first things that he said to me was, tell everybody you can about Ori, right? Not tell everybody who's practicing this particular spirituality, but tell everybody about this thing, because everybody has Ori. Like, for him, as an indigenous Yoruba person, he felt that everybody needed to understand this because it was that big of a deal, and I've taken that very seriously over
Yeah.
the years. um, and at the end of the day, when we start to cohere with that, life just starts to look different in little tiny ways and in great big ways, and everything in between. So
Yeah. So how would you define or explain Ori to, a toddler, let's say?
yeah, that's super tricky. It's super tricky. So it is a facet. You can look at it as kind of the wholeness of who you are, like sort of the full potential of who you are and what you can be and what your way through the world looks like. And so it's this, the kind of the idea behind it is like we each choose our own Ori as we're getting ready to be born. And so in that, there's all of the possibilities for your life. And the thing is, like, it's weird to talk about Ori the way we are, because we're talking about it as a separate thing, but so I always say that it's distinct from you, but it's not separate from you, right? So it's you, but more, kind of a thing, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it really does have to do with sort of the potential for who you are in your life, really, is sort of the short version. And people say, well, is it like soul? Kind of. Is it like higher self? Well, not exactly. So there's all of these ideas that, people try to say, oh, well, it's like this. Well, it's not really like anything else I've ever bumped into. It's kind of like Ori is Ori. And like, I'm not being sarcastic when I say that, but it just kind of is its own unique thing. And
Yeah.
so I think, potential is really kind of the easiest way to talk about it.
Gotcha. So there's no other correlate for it. It's really
Yeah,
it's independent of any
yeah,
other concept. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Very cool. And so the program, can you tell me a little bit more about the practical, like what's the vision for the program?
Yeah, so it's called Cohering with the Spirit of Destiny, and it's basically a 20-month kind of a thing, which is kind of a super long time, but it's a long time because it's kind of a big topic, right? And I think for those of us that have not grown up knowing about it, it just takes some time to understand it and to figure out, okay, so how do we engage in this relationship in a way that is good and functional and makes sense? And how do we even get our minds around thinking about these indigenous concepts that are probably unfamiliar to most of us, and how do we do that in a way where we're not bringing kind of weird outside stuff to it that doesn't really fit?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of it. It's essentially sort of understanding what Ori is and how you connect with it in the different ways that you communicate with it and work with it and cohere with it. And I think people that understand art in a lot of forms will understand it, because part of the way Ori communicates is through symbols, and part of the way we communicate with Ori is through symbols. And so, I think artists and creative people in general seem to have a little bit easier time understanding that, which is
Mhm.
cool.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's sort of, I mean, to me, at the end of the day, it comes down to we're just spending 20 months figuring out how you can move with your destiny instead of against it, is really what it comes down to. So
Sure. And how much do you correlate Ori with creativity? Like, is there a creative process that puts you in touch with the Ori?
yeah, so to me, I think the creativity in part comes through that, right? Because your Ori is sort of in touch with and connected to everything that moves through you. So if the ancestors are connected to your creative process, then it's sort of like Ori is a bridge between those two things. Your Ori has a lot to do with inspiration. It has a lot to do with clarity. It has to do with why your lineage is what it is. So, in other words, the fact that my lineage was street art and Basquiat, that's an Ori thing. Like my Ori directed, because there's this thing my elder used to say all the time is, what my Ori has for me is for me, and what your Ori has for you is for you, and that means a lot of different things. But what just in terms of creativity, like you will have your own creative lineage that your Ori has moved you in the direction of, and all have the same thing. And so when we recognize that, then we understand that my Ori has sort of aligned me with these creative things that have formed this lineage. And so that not only is directly connected to, but it in some ways becomes the sort of foundation or fuel source for my creativity. And it's the same for everybody's creativity. It's the same thing. Yeah.
Sure. And so who would you say the program is really for?
It's funny, like the easy answer is everybody, which is weird because I've never said that about anything I teach ever. Like I'm usually very I usually never even talk about the stuff I teach publicly. Like for 20 years, it's all been stuff that I've shared in very private spaces. But I think because to me, Ori is just how you make your way through the world. So to me, it's for anybody who wants to make their way through the world in a better, clearer, more coherent way that is able to kind of open up a sort of ease and clarity that might have been elusive, or kind of start and stop and here and there, or just not there at all for some people sometimes. So yeah,
Sure, sure.
yeah.
Well, at this point, usually I ease into leading a meditation
Cool.
to kind of close off the energy and the talk and everything. Would you like to join me in that?
Absolutely, for
Okay,
sure.
wonderful. Is there anything else you want to share before we get started?
No, this was great. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so let's go ahead and you can turn off your mic and your video if you'd like to. Um, and we can just shut our eyes and drop into the body. Take a few deep breaths, letting the belly expand, letting the chest rise without restriction, without holding back or controlling. Feeling a sense of aliveness, the subtle presence of life in the body, in the breath, in the energy and the sensations coursing through the body. And surrendering deeper into that subtle sense of aliveness, that gentle buzz of energy, feeling it spread throughout the entire body, the structure of the body. And opening up to the messages in that aliveness. These can be messages of pleasure, messages of pain or tension, messages of pure sensation without any value judgments or labels applied to them. Warmth, coolness, density, lightness. Just the basic qualities of being without a narrative. And as that narrative drops away, experiencing direct contact with those sensations, direct relationship with those sensations, with the body, with the structure of the body, the sensations of the body, and the body as an integral entity, as a whole. What does it feel like to be alive in your body in this moment? No expectation of what that should be or shouldn't be. No right or wrong way to experience it. It simply is aliveness expressing in your body. And if the mind begins to wander or get distracted or to shift back to that narrative way of being, like, oh, this is the tense part of my body, this is the uncomfortable part, this happened because of this. Just let it dissolve again into the sensation itself, the temperature, the texture, the flavor, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, whether the mind wants to label it good or bad. Allowing ourselves to be the witness of our experience, hosting that experience rather than narrating it or judging it. Letting that experience speak to us rather than the other way around, rather than the mind imposing any ideas on the experience. And returning to the breath over and over and over again as our anchor into now. What is the body? What is the current experience? And what does life have to say to us if we listen? What is the message being communicated if we're silent and receptive? And even as we receive that message, we don't have to do anything with it. It isn't a puzzle to be solved or a mystery that needs unveiling, but just something to be in touch with, to commune with directly right now in this moment. letting it come and letting it go as it wishes. Always coming back again and again to the breath. And then as you're ready, you can begin to ground yourself into the space that you're in, feeling the sit bones on the surface that you're sitting on, feeling yourself occupying space, feeling the air against the skin, feeling the structure of the building that you're in, expanding the awareness outward until you feel that you're here and anchored in time and space. And then when you feel ready, you can gently open the eyes and come out of your meditation. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It was a real pleasure to have you.
That was awesome. Thank you. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.
You too.